I'm Richard Grusin. I'm director of the Center for 21st Century Studies. I'm really glad to have all of you here on a kind of crummy Milwaukee spring day. Hopefully it'll be less crummy after our presentation. First thing I wanted to do is just tell folks about a couple of upcoming center events for the rest of the semester. Next Friday on April 20th, Gabriel Minotti, who's a visiting Fulbright professor here from Brazil, will be talking on 3D replication technologies, digital artifacts for the radical mediation of history. And then on April 27th, a collaboratory that we're sponsoring in media studies will be hosting Alison McCracken, and she'll be talking about America's first pop idol, the rise and fall of Rudy Valley. And then finally, May 3rd through 5th is the annual spring conference for the center, and the theme for that conference for this year is Ends of Cinema. It's a conference that's looking forward to the 50th anniversary celebration of the center, which will be happening in the fall of 2018, sort of kicked off in May. Okay, and then finally, in terms of business announcements, after the talk, we'll have a reception upstairs, and you're welcome to come join us on the 9th floor and continue the conversation there. Okay, so this panel on social media and academic freedom is part 3 of a series that we've sponsored in the spring on regulating speech in the university. And this third event is focusing on the explosion of social media in the 21st century, which has posed a host of new problems for public and private employers, including small businesses, large corporations, and local, state, and federal institutions. Over the past several years, colleges and universities in particular have been involved in many instances in which professors have been vilified and attacked for things they've tweeted or posted on Facebook. The aim of this symposium is to take up the ways in which social media have come to impact and indeed to threaten academic freedom. The proliferation of social media has raised new questions about academic freedom, particularly about what's covered and what kinds of things are covered and what the roles of college and university administrators are in protecting their faculty. Both because there's a question about the status of faculty communication online and because online media have become venues for coordinated or orchestrated attacks on faculty, whether through groups like Campus Reform and Professor Watch List, or formal and informal right-wing media sites. Over the past 5 years, there have been a number of examples of cases in which one of these two things have happened, in which, and sometimes both, in which faculty have been challenged, disciplined, or fired for communications they've made on social media, or for instances, and sometimes, as I said, both, instances then in which social media has been weaponized by right-wing groups in particular against faculty, and often to the extent of driving them out of their positions, either voluntarily or involuntarily. So, for example, just to list a few, beginning as far back as, which in internet years as far back as 2013, David Guth at the University of Kansas was a professor who condemned the NRA, and in so doing, on Facebook, I think, in so doing prompted the University of Kansas to institute a set of rules about faculty communication on social media, and basically to insist that anything faculty members said on social media should be considered a part of their expression as members of the university community, and therefore had to be regulated according to guidelines put forth by the university. Sarah Bond at the University of Iowa in 2017 was targeted by white supremacists for reporting in her classroom and elsewhere that the ancient world, despite the way it's often taught, was not uniformly white, or that figures in the ancient world. Stephanie McKellop is a Penn TA who got slammed recently for tweeting about a pedagogical technique called progressive stack, in which students were called on sort of through a kind of algorithm in relation to their social positioning, and a kind of algorithm that put white male students last in this progressive stack, and she was vilified online for that, and also disciplined by Penn, the University of Pennsylvania. Amanda Gailey in University of Nebraska was the target of a really nasty smear campaign for criticizing a student at the Turning Point table, this Turning Point is a right-wing organization funded by the Koch brothers and others, and she was punished for that. Then, in addition to those examples, I think many of the examples have focused on questions of race and ethnicity, and I think both Steve and Gio will probably address those issues in their conversations. And at our first event of the year, many of you were here to see Johnny Eric Williams from Trinity, who, in being critical of white supremacy around the Steve Scalise shooting online, was suspended but later reinstated by Trinity College. Also Keeanga Yamada Taylor of Princeton, who called out Trump as a racist in a commencement speech at Hampshire College, was subject of vicious online right-wing attacks. Saida Grundy from African American Studies at Boston U is criticized by Fox and others for her tweets on anti-black racism and white supremacy. Tommy Curry at Texas A&M was tweeted, "Is it okay for whites to kill blacks?" and was attacked by American Conservative Post and then videos on YouTube and others. And Zandria Robinson at University of Memphis, who is the chair of the Africana Studies Department and a professor of sociology, was forced to resign. She took a position in Memphis at a private college, Rhodes College, because of her criticism of white violence against blacks. So those are just some examples of things that have gone on in this area over the years. Steve and Gio also have been subject to these similar attacks, and they'll talk about those and other things in just a minute. Before I introduce them, though, I wanted to say something then a little more personal about my own involvement a couple years ago in questions of social media, academic freedom, and so forth. And it's pretty minor in its consequences compared to the things I've read and compared to the consequences that Steve and Gio have faced, but it makes this event kind of particularly close to my heart. As many of you know, and I'm sure many of you don't know, during 2015, especially the first half of 2015, I spent a good deal of time blogging and on social media, as many people here did in those venues and other places, fighting against the draconian budget cuts in the University of Wisconsin system, the attempts to turn the system into a public authority, to dismantle tenure and academic freedom and so forth, most of which have been, to one degree or another, pretty successful, unfortunately, successful efforts by the state and by the system. And during that time, well, I think the easiest way to just explain it is I'll read to you a letter that I wrote to Chancellor Monet that recounted an event that happened to me the 2nd of June of 2015. So, dear Chancellor Monet, I write to protest in the strongest possible terms an act of intimidation carried out this afternoon by 2 members of the UWM Police Department on behalf of the UWM administration. Not only did this police action constitute a gross misuse of UWM resources, but it also committed an actionable violation of my First Amendment rights to free speech. When I returned to my office on that day in Curtin Hall from an emergency meeting of the Faculty Senate, I was surprised to find 2 armed, uniformed UWM police officers waiting for me outside my office. They asked to talk to me inside the office. The purpose of their visit was to investigate a tweet I had written in response to a blog post by my UWM faculty colleague, Rachel Buff, a blog post calling for formation of faculty union, solidarity, and so forth. And that tweet read, "A heartfelt plea for solidarity from Rachelita tweets, but methinks unions aren't enough. Armed insurrection, anyone?" The lead officer, Lieutenant John Krusik, and this was a couple of weeks before this, I believe, told me that because the Board of Regents was meeting on campus on Thursday and Friday of that week, the administration was concerned that I might be planning some kind of intervention, like an armed insurrection. Lieutenant Krusik said that he knew I was passionate about what's been happening to the UW system lately, and he held up a whole pile of printed either tweets or blog entries or whatever in his hand, although he only showed me the offending one at the time. And he said that officers had been asked to check up on me to make sure I wasn't planning anything that might endanger the meeting of the Board of Regents. He likened this to a situation where a student might say or post on social media something threatening to his professor, which would prompt the campus police to speak with the student. I should not have to tell, this is to Chancellor Mone, I should not have to tell an educated academic like yourself how faulty this analogy is. My tweet was written in response to a colleague's blog post about solidarity, and the armed insurrection anyone was clearly lighthearted wordplay on the common expression tennis anyone. That this tweet could be construed as a threat, or to whom it might be threatening, is beyond me. The only threat involved in this situation was by the UWM campus police, and by extension your administration, against me. The message was clearly meant to deter me from exercising my right to free speech. We're watching you, so you better watch what you say. Indeed, what's most troubling about the event was not the interaction with the two UWM police officers who behaved professionally and politely, but the fact that, and were actually a little bit embarrassed, it seemed, but although they did have guns, but the fact that someone in your administration appears to be closely monitoring my social media activities. In addition to monitoring my public speech, someone in your administration is concerned enough about my passionate opposition to the destruction of tenure, shared governance, and academic freedom that they wanted to send me a message of intimidation. Sadly, I have over the past several months been cautioned by colleagues, friends, and family to be careful about speaking out against your administration and the UW system, but I've repeatedly insisted that neither you nor President Cross would seek retribution against me merely for speaking my mind against policies which you both support. I hope I'm right, but it's a sad state of affairs that people who care about me feel motivated to warn me about passionately expressing my opinions. Their concern about my welfare speaks volumes about how both your administration and the University of Wisconsin system are currently perceived. I would encourage you to keep monitoring my tweets and Facebook updates. You might not like what you read, but you might learn something. I'll be posting a copy of this letter on social media, and if necessary, I'm prepared to share it with an attorney. I will not allow myself to be intimidated from continuing to criticize the ongoing destruction of a great public university system and your unwillingness to say or do anything to try to stop it. And I got a brief response from the chancellor that indicated that he wasn't monitoring me. He had been alerted by the president of the UW system that he might look into this. So yes, I was being monitored, but apparently by the system, not by my own chancellor. I don't know if that was reassuring or not. Anyway, so part of the reason that this is such a, for me, that this hits close to the heart is that I've had my own really small experience compared to the experience of the people that I've read about momentarily and about the people who you're going to hear speak today, both of whom have suffered, I think, much more severe consequences than I did. We were talking earlier, and I said one of the advantages of being at UWM and having a fairly incompetent administration is that you don't get, that they're not necessarily together enough to mobilize in ways that are really punitive or dangerous. So there's certainly something to be said for that. Okay, so I'll introduce both Steve Salaita and George now just briefly and then turn the floor over to them. So Steve Salaita received his BA in political science from Radford University in 1997, his MA in English from Radford in 99. He completed his PhD at the University of Oklahoma in Native American Studies with a literature emphasis. His first academic position was, I hadn't known this until recently, at UW-Whitewater, where he was there for a couple of years until 2006, just down the street. He then moved to Virginia Tech, where he was tenured in 2009. And then in, I believe it was about probably 2013, he was offered a professorship in Native American Studies at the University of Illinois, and I think deferred that for a year, and after that was going to take up his professorship in 2014. He resigned his position at Virginia Tech. His courses were in the course schedule for the fall. And then, kind of out of the blue, in the summer of 2014, he was abruptly dehired by UIUC Chancellor Phyllis Wise. The public reason, or ostensible reason for his dehiring, was a series of impassioned tweets he'd made about the Israeli occupation of Palestine, which were characterized by faculty and administrators at Illinois as evidence of his lack of collegiality and his unwillingness to embrace diverse ideas in the classroom. As was later revealed, however, the dehiring was really motivated by wealthy alumni and members of the university's board who had threatened to withhold financial support from the university if they went through with his hire. A year later, he taught for a year as the visiting Edward Said Professor of American Studies at Beirut University. And since then, he's been, not really entirely by choice, an independent scholar. George Ciccariello-Maher did his undergraduate work at St. Lawrence University and at the University of Cambridge, where he was a Davies-Jackson Scholar. He then completed a master's and PhD at UC Berkeley in political science in 2010, and was shortly thereafter appointed as assistant professor of politics and global studies at Drexel University in Philadelphia the same year. In October 2017, Gio became nationally known in the US and outside after tweeting, "All I want for Christmas is white genocide," another facetious tongue-in-cheek tweet. And following several other controversial tweets he'd posted, Drexel University placed him on administrative leave, quote, "for his own safety," last semester, fall of 2017. No, that right? Yeah, fall. I'm not sure I've got the dates on these right. I think that first tweet was like Christmas 2016, right? On December 28th of this year, he announced his resignation from Drexel, effective the end of the year, citing nearly a year of harassment by right-wing white supremacist media outlets and internet mobs after death threats and threats of violence directed against me and my family. So, as I said, I mean, these are pretty significant events. I think Steve and George will tell you something about sort of their experience, but I think each of them will want to talk more broadly about these the issues surrounding them. Anyway, help me to welcome them.
How about now?
Yeah.
Okay, please tell me if my voice becomes too loud or starts flagging. I tend to move a little bit as I speak. Thank you very much for coming out and spending a gloomy Friday afternoon with us. Before I delve into my comments, I want to thank Professor Grusin for the invite, for setting up this panel. I think that we have the potential to have a really interesting conversation. And I wanted to thank the graduate students in the Center for 21st Century Studies for so diligently arranging our travel and for their hospitality. And it's been a real pleasure being here so far. There are any number of directions that I could go in sort of this, talking about my experiences of academic freedom and the controversies that followed. So I wanted to talk a little bit from an experiential point of view, and then try to shift the discussion a little bit into some more structural issues. If there's something that you would like to hear me discuss that I didn't get around to, please do raise the point during the Q&A. I think we'll have plenty of time to talk. If there's something I say that doesn't make sense to you or that you want to argue with, feel free also to register your objection in the Q&A. And I want to make sure that the conversation focuses on some of the things that you're interested in. When Richard was reading that very small tweet that Gio had sent that ended up getting him in so much trouble, All I Want for Christmas is White Genocide, it brought something back into my mind, and I started thinking about how bizarre it was for me, and I'm sure it was for Gio and for anybody else who has faced social media controversy, to have one's tweets being closely read by so many people and being parsed down to the last syllable by so many people. And it's affected me in the sense that, I was never a heavy social media user, and I'm still not. I use it regularly, but I wouldn't say that I use it frequently. And there have been periods where I don't use it at all, but every time I send a tweet now, I go through a mental process where I ask myself, okay, what would a judge think about this? What would 6 lawyers, right, think about it? More than 6 lawyers. I have 6 lawyers, all right? That doesn't include the opposition, right? What would they think about this? In what ways might this tweet be interpreted? If I'm ever up for an academic job ever again, how might this tweet read if it gets put on the desk of a dean or a provost or a chancellor, or even worse, somebody from the board of trustees, right? And these I want to emphasize that this thought process doesn't stop me from saying what I want to say. Like a lot of people have tried to find the formula that would get me to shut up. Everyone from my family when I was a child to my political interlocutors from the other side of the spectrum on Palestine, and there doesn't seem to be an easy solution for that. But what I'm saying is that it creates a situation where we have to think in the context of how our words might appease or offend power. So in other words, power becomes the primary arbiter, at least implicitly, of what we are able to say or what we're supposed to say online. And this is a phenomenon, I think, that affects most everybody who is gainfully employed, who uses a social media account, even if it's private. One of the first pieces of advice, in fact, that secondary school teachers give to their students now is that what you say online, college people are going to be reading it. When you're in college, they tell you, your future employers might be reading this, and so forth and so on. And so we understand when we use social media, even if we're just posting selfies, right, that we are not in a neutral space, that we're in a space that's mediated, that's moderated in some ways, and that is certainly surveilled by sites of power or by political operatives, and done so in a way that is not trained on the well-being of the user, but trained on satisfying the needs of power. In 2014, and I've told this story so many times in the past 4 years or so, that it always changes. And it's not because the events change, but really my understanding of the events changes also with time. I forget certain things, I remember certain things, but basically I had sent a series of tweets, and this is during the summer of 2014, about Israel's, was it Operation Cast Lead? They have so many different stupidly named massacres that I never know what the army calls them. But this is in 2014, and just as I was about to take up my position in American Indian Studies at the University of Illinois, I still remember this, it was on August 2nd, which was a Saturday. I received a email from the chancellor of the university, Phyllis Weiss, and I opened it up and it basically said, don't bother coming, your appointment no longer exists. And that set off a chain of events that swept me away and has changed my life pretty dramatically. I understood immediately that nothing was being withdrawn, that in fact I had been fired. That's the way that the AAUP interpreted it. That's the way that a federal judge who oversaw the lawsuit I brought against the university interpreted it. That's essentially what happened. I would change probably a decent amount of things that I've done in the time since I received that letter, but one thing I wouldn't change is sending those tweets. I don't regret sending them. I would not take them back. People have asked me to apologize for them and take them back, and I refuse to do neither. And I refuse to remain quiet about Palestine and a host of interrelated issues of concern to me and the people around me. What always gets lost when we parse tweets and their language and whether they're sarcastic or not and what they mean or not. So take the case of Gio's white genocide tweet or my tweet talking about how I wish the settlers would go missing, these sorts of things is, in all of those close readings, we lose sight of a very important contextual picture. And so everything becomes a referendum on the probity of the individual. What kind of person is Gio? Do I like Gio or do I not like Gio? Right? People were commenting on his facial hair online. People were commenting on tone. And this is something that I experienced and continue to experience. Well, I really don't like Steve. I don't like the language he uses. Those tweets don't make sense to me. I disapprove of his tweets, et cetera, et cetera. And at the time, I found those kinds of responses particularly troublesome because they showed a lack of interest in articulating solidarity, first of all, but second of all, because they were missing the point. The point isn't how an individual tweets. The point is that there was an organized response to a radical academic that, if it ends up being successful, will threaten the well-being of all of us who are working in academia. That's the point. It's not, don't use Twitter because people are watching. We shouldn't condemn the user of social media. We should condemn the people who are watching and the people who are acting on it and the people who are using social media as a pretext to intervene in the lives and careers of their political opponents. That's where the problem lies, and that's where the responsibility should exist. And so in my case, as I've already mentioned, it really focuses around Palestine. That's an issue that's been of interest to me for a very long time, and I found it even more troublesome that people were forgetting the political context in which the tweets were made. That over the course of 51 days in the summer of 2014, Israel killed approximately 2,100 people in the Gaza Strip. 51 days. They bombed schools, they bombed hospitals, they bombed UN shelters, they bombed dense residential areas. They ended up killing, over the course again of 51 days, 551 children. The dead were piling up so rapidly that Gaza, in the middle of summer, without electricity, because Israel also had bombed Gaza's only electrical plant, were being stored in ice cream freezers. 4 years later, almost 4 years later, many of the people there still have no homes to live in, still have no hospitals to seek medical treatment, and are continuing to face the continuous, horrible violence. And that context is important because I don't want to be made into a symbol of anything, least of all of Palestine. that Palestine is an issue that needs to be understood within its own geography and within its own history, and I don't want to arbitrate our understanding of Palestine through my Twitter account. If I was punished because I was using my Twitter account, that is only because the people of Palestine, and in that case the people of the Gaza Strip, were suffering something much more terrible that the elite, the power brokers, that the State Department, that respectable academics and so forth didn't want being discussed. And so when you encounter a social media controversy, if I might be presumptuous enough to offer unsolicited advice, and of course you don't have to do this, but I really encourage you to look at the political context of the controversy, of the tweet itself, or the Facebook post, or whatever it is, and then try to attach that controversy to a broader geopolitical framework, and understand what features of that geopolitical framework caused the issue, caused the statement, the comment to be controversial in the first place. So, Richard talked about Johnny Williams and Saida Grundy and other black scholars who have faced tons of controversy. And I know that Gio really can talk about the properties of those controversies better than I can, but you know, immediately the framework gets set around how their words affect white people, right? And how white people feel about what they're saying. And so we end up missing the entire context of what gave rise to the tweeter's anger, or to the tweeter's concern, whatever you want to call it, in the first place. We lose sight of the fact that police departments across the country are wantonly killing black people and getting away with it without a shred of punishment. We lose sight of the fact that there continues to be structural racism in housing, in academia, in the job economy, and so forth. Those are the issues that we ought to end up training our focus on, and then we need to think about then, why are some people getting upset, and what means do they have to act on their offense? Because we all get offended. I hear things that bother me all the time. As somebody of Palestinian background, I hear shit being said about Palestinians that's horrible, all the time. I hear people justifying the murder of Palestinian children, all the time. I hear all the time that my culture is innately terroristic. Right? I hear all the time that I'm not capable of interacting with modernity or democracy, right? Because of cultural barriers to civility and so forth. And so you all know the stereotypes, you all know the narratives, right? They're common enough to where what I'm saying should not be a surprise. What ability do I have to act on that offense? None, because the Palestine Solidarity community has next to zero institutional power in this country. And that's how we need to understand free speech and academic freedom, not as isolated phenomena that exist in a vacuum, right? That are on a flattened plane to which everybody has equal access, right? That people get punished based on their speech, right? Not because one group of people is inherently saying something worse or more offensive than another group of people, but because centers of power get to decide what constitutes offense, and likewise centers of power get to decide how to intervene and what kind of punishment should attend to offensive speech because they have the ability to do that. We don't have a center of black institutional power in the United States that is shutting down people's free speech. That kind of organized communal power simply doesn't exist. There is no center of institutional Palestinian power that is shutting down people's free speech. Not that I would want them to, don't get me wrong. But what I'm saying is the idea that we ought to understand speech and academic freedom outside of power and outside of politics is apocryphal. And it is only going to, that sort of approach of looking at it as an isolated sort of universal occurrence is going to limit our understanding both of the act of speaking and the context in which speech occurs. And so, at the University of Illinois, for example, They had a guy, I forget his first name. He's emeritus now. His last name was Weisberg. And he was an out-and-out white supremacist. Like, literally. You know, I'm not even talking white supremacist in kind of the academic sense of the term, as somebody who's tacitly committed to the reproduction of whiteness. I'm talking about the dude was a Nazi, right? Like, straight up, you know. He supported my firing, by the way, because in addition to being a white supremacist, he's also a Zionist. I don't know. These things don't make any sense to me. But anyway, you know, nobody had ever intervened, even when he gave an overtly racist speech at the John Birch Society. At Virginia Tech, I got in a ton of trouble. And this is where my understanding of right-wing outrage comes from, right? Because Gio's situation and my situation are pretty damn similar in a lot of ways. But I would say also, though, that Gio incurred the wrath of sort of the hard right or right-wing audience, whereas I incurred the wrath of the pro-Israel crowd. There's a lot of overlap there, and there are a lot of similarities. But anyway, I wrote a piece in Salon, like in 2012, 2013, I can't remember the dates either, that was sort of advising people, I thought in a very polite way, to think critically about the phrase "support our troops," right? And saying that, you know, the troops have become a consumer category, and they become the object of corporate charity, and, you know, so forth and so on. And Virginia Tech is a big ROTC school. It's kind of the Texas A&M of the Mid-Atlantic, and I just got pilloried. And they you know, the administrators and the brass in the ROTC were trying to get me fired. My own department chair threw me under the bus. I was living in Blacksburg, Virginia. If you don't know Blacksburg, Virginia, it's a really small town. Everybody knows where everybody lives. You know, I was getting the death threats. You know, I had an 18-month-old child at the time. People were leaving me voicemails saying they're going to kill both of us. You know, the usual stuff. Right? And I don't mean to minimize it for anybody who's experienced it, but for anybody who has experienced it, you know it's the usual stuff. Most of it you shrug off, right? But some of it gets legitimately scary, right? You know, once they start invoking, you know, infants, then it's like, okay, this fool is serious. All right, this isn't somebody who's just letting off steam. Anyway, amid all of that, all right, you know, the university had to send me around with a police escort. It was bizarre. The university kept releasing statements disavowing what I was saying. He doesn't represent the university. We'd love to fire him, but we can't because he has tenure. I'm paraphrasing, but it's an accurate paraphrase, right? That you know, basically whipping up the kind of animosity, or at least validating the sort of animosity that I was in. And it was an awful experience, and in lots of ways, it was a more awful experience than what I went through with the University of Illinois. And I mean that, because I felt physically vulnerable in that moment, and the university out and out validated the anger of the mob in that moment, and I felt had served me up for recrimination or other kinds of potentially awful things. Well, fast forward 3 years later, and it turns out that the Department of English at Virginia Tech has a literal Nazi teaching in it as a graduate student. Literally. The full menu of anti-Semitic statements, the full menu of anti-black statements. Again, I don't need to repeat them because unfortunately we're all familiar with them. All right, and it's straight up, worse than Weisberg even. Has he been removed from his teaching position? No. A group of leftist students of color, complained and raised concern in what I felt was a very respectful and intelligent and proper way. Okay? Nothing. The university publicly stood by his right to free speech. The English department stood up for his right to free speech. This has no bearing on his teaching. It's a matter of academic freedom. And the Nazi is still teaching at Virginia Tech. Not once has the administration at Virginia Tech deigned to say, well, he doesn't represent the collective psyche of the Virginia Tech community. That's why, by the way, what they said about me, I just remembered. Salaita doesn't represent the collective psyche of the Virginia Tech community. And can you think of a more fascist statement than invoking a collective psyche? Like, wow, thank God I don't. You know, it's a collective I don't want to belong to. But anyway, So I'm giving these examples partly for catharsis, but also to show that if there are differences in the way that different forms of speech are treated, it's only because, or mainly because, there are differences in what kind of power gets exercised around certain forms of offense. And there are a few surefire things that will always get you in trouble in an academic space if the right or wrong people get wind of them. One is criticism of Israel, or even more precisely, criticism of Zionism. Because you can criticize Israel and then still be within the boundaries of acceptable discussion, but if you condemn the ideology of Zionism, then you're in trouble. We've seen that happen over and over again. I'm certainly not the first person that happened to, and certainly won't be the last. If you criticize the police or the military, you will get in trouble. If you criticize structural racism, you'll get in trouble. In other words, if your comment or your critique is aimed at an institutional structural site of state power, right, then it tends to lead to trouble, or has the potential to lead to trouble. And this is not an accident, of course. In lots of ways, universities are increasingly conditioned to be purveyors of state interests, business interests, military interests. And so these kinds of contrapuntal or revolutionary or radical, whatever you want to call them, critiques aren't necessarily welcome on campus anymore. And in closing, so I can turn it over to Gio, I've been talking for too long. Thanks for entertaining me. In closing, I would say that I would like to point out that we cannot separate the phenomena from the broader context of what's happening to U.S. universities in general. Anybody in Wisconsin has a good idea of the way that public universities are being undermined and in some cases ruined by state legislatures. Wisconsin is a terrible example of that. It's one of the greatest, and I used to work in it for 3 years, very proudly, one of the greatest state university systems in this country. It embodies, or embodied anyway, so many of the better ideals that attended to the notion and the development of public education in this country. And it's been absolutely gutted. Dissent is unwelcome. And faculty are increasingly being shrunk, students are being fleeced, adjunct or contingent faculty are beginning to fill the ranks of the classroom, and as state money and state appropriations in general shrink, the reliance increases on private donations, on corporate money, and as that reliance on corporate money, on private money, let's call it, as the reliance on private money increases, the range of dissent gets institutionally restricted. Right? It's not random people getting upset who ended up getting me fired from the University of Illinois. It was people with money, donors, who told the university I'm withholding my contributions who got me fired. And the universities are in a position now, yes, some of them are always going to voluntarily follow the money, but they're in a position now to where they can't afford to offend the private sector or the state, right? The state apparatus, the military apparatus particularly, the consultation apparatus, because their budget has become so dependent on these funding sources. I think I've said enough. If you have any questions for me, I'm glad to discuss them later, either during the Q&A or at the reception. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for that, Steve. I'm glad to be here. So much of what you said resonates with me on a personal level, but also in terms of what I'm going to say. The kind of theoretical, I think, and analytic moves that I want to make are things that you're also doing because they're right? Because this is what we need to do to understand what's happening today. So we're called upon to talk about social media, and specifically the two of us, of course, ended up in controversies that began on Twitter. And there are reasons for that. I think there are reasons for that. I think it's worth pointing out and understanding what some of those are. I too have looked at a stack of printed tweets being scrutinized by someone else and felt bizarrely, I think it's really hard to explain what that feels like, especially because these are tweets that are 140 characters. But at the same time, we're talking about over the past year, more than 250 attacks on faculty, many of which had nothing to do with tweets, many of which only tangentially connect to even the question of social media. Kiembe Imana-Taylor received some of the most brutal death threats that you could imagine, racist, misogynistic, homophobic, for a graduation speech. Tommy Curry at Texas A&M for a podcast that was 4 years old at that point. Many others for many other kinds of statements, whether it's Facebook, whether it's retweeting or reposting, or other statements, the use of words that were not even their own, in the case of John Eric Williams. And so one of the things that we're confronted with immediately is the immediate reaction, which is to say this is a problem with Twitter. Right? You should just get off Twitter. No one should use Twitter, which is, it's, on the one hand, it sounds like old people yelling at clouds. And on the other hand, it's just absurd because this is not about the mode in which the media is being disseminated. It's got to do with what's going on in the world today. It's not about Twitter in particular. It's about a certain kind of virality that is being spread by humans and by non-human actors, but that is done in an organized way, as Steve mentioned, and specifically that has a certain ideological material terrain. I think that's what we need to do from the very beginning, is to map that out. These are not abstract questions. It's not a question of what is the role of social media, it's the question of what is the political, social, economic, material terrain that we confront when we're making public intellectual statements, and specifically when we're working in the university context today. What is that terrain? I think we can look at our moment, and we can situate that moment in the broad context, the broad contours of what's been going on for a couple of decades. Over the past year, as I said, we've seen this explosion in attacks on faculty, and that's no accident. It coincides with the emergence of Trump, of Trumpism, of the movements that both led Trump to power and which were unleashed in that energy around this renewed white supremacy and nativism that he represents, as both cause and effect. But of course, the Salaita, Grundy, and others came before that, because we're talking about a much broader tendency, a much broader material transformation that gives rise to where we are in the present. The moment that we occupy, that we inhabit, I think could be understood as a moment of crisis, of rupture, of polarization, and ultimately of populism. I'll say in a minute what I mean by that. The center is collapsing. Liberalism, the sort of fusion of liberalism and capitalism, liberal democracy and capitalism, is really crumbling worldwide. And it is in this collapse that we find the reemergence of extreme right-wing white supremacy, open fascism, anti-Semitism, Nazism, and also the alternative, radical alternative. Because when you have the collapse of the center, you have the possibilities on both the right and the left historically. And this is the kind of moment, I think, that we find ourselves in. So whether it's the collapse of the Eurozone that is giving rise to this dramatic increase in white supremacy in Eastern Europe in particular, or the collapse of the sort of Clintonite, democratic, neoliberal hegemony in the US, which has left abandoned hundreds of thousands, if not millions of people who are ripe for a new nativism, a new white supremacy in the United States. And whether it's these economic material factors or the utter suicidal nature of liberalism that is unable to recognize what's going on, unable to confront it, incapable of thinking of anything outside of pragmatism, consensus, dialogue, discussion in Congress. We're looking at a situation in which the sort of banality of Hillary Clinton's campaign is the perfect expression of the inherent contradictions of liberalism that cannot confront either the economic conditions that we confront today or the emergence of the right-wing alternative. It's this failure of liberalism in many ways that's given rise to this. And I think this, I keep pointing to it because I think it points directly as well to what it means to resist this, to fight it, and what kind of strategic alternatives we can bring forth. We see this failure when we look directly at the emergence of these movements in the present, whether it's the discussions of Antifa, the discussions of Trump. I mean, Trump, of course, was being called a fascist by the Democrats until he actually won. And then he very immediately was given a chance to govern, in Hillary Clinton's words. Whereas those who took to the streets, whether just disaffected Democrats or the far left or others, understood what was going on and understood the need to fight against a legitimately elected president, regardless of that legitimacy. When you see the emergence of Antifa against white supremacists in the streets, and you start to find this moral equivalence being played out at first by the Democrats that claims that they're the same, the far left and the far right, that they share some kind of ground when they're actually very much the opposite. And when you only see that moral equivalency breaking down when Trump repeats it about Charlottesville, and then finally everyone says, oh, wait, this is disgusting, you said there's bad people and good people on both sides, but that's exactly what the liberals and the Democrats were saying up until that point. And this is the inability to recognize and confront these realities and to understand what it takes to resist them. The material reality, if we sort of then focus in a bit more on the university, I think Steve pointed very well to what we're up against, the long-term transformation, structural transformation of universities, private and public. The neoliberalization of the university, again, you all are very familiar with this, I think, and very familiar with what kind of havoc is being wrought on the system, the overt class project of destroying that system, of replacing full-time professors with adjuncts, which, to be clear, is not simply an economic question, it's not simply a question of declining quality of education, but it's a political strategy as well, because it's replacing people who can organize and can fight and can struggle with those who, for material and political reasons, are very constrained in the way that they can do so. It's an attempt to create a compliant workforce as it creates a compliant student body. A student body that's bound to debt, that when you graduate, you can't take some time and figure out what you want to do or explore your options because you have hundreds of thousands of dollars worth of debt that you then need to pay. This is part of the material contours, the material reality. As Steve also pointed out, this role of private funding, which dramatically limits acceptable speech, which dramatically constrains that speech on campus, is a huge part of what's happening as well. And I would also point out that this money is the money that brings far-right provocateurs to campus. We're not talking about Richard Spencer or Milo or Charles Murray being invited by academic units or being invited for the quality of their research. I mean, Charles Murray fakes research quality when he's a pseudoscientific eugenicist who is paid by dark money to write books about these biological and genetic inferiorities of people. Paid, those people, the same dark money sources then pay for the book to be published and then pay journalists to read it and pay them to review it. And this is a sort of pay for play that's been happening in these circuits for a while. And this is part and parcel of this neoliberalization, right? Because you really do see the impact of this money. I debated a really sort of nauseating person once named Camille Paglia. Maybe people know her. I'm not sure why I did, but I did. When I got there to debate her, there were about 20 people in the audience, and they were all sort of fanboys of her because she hates women, and so she's a lot of fanboys. And I was wondering why the auditorium was empty, and it was because it was literally paid for by a rich alum donor who had just handed a pile of money over for this event to happen. Not for any reason other than that. It was literally the money dictating that this event should take place. And we should be very clear that this is what's happening. That this is what's happening because it impacts how we then confront it, whether we understand this as academic freedom or free speech or anything related to those questions, which I would argue we don't, we shouldn't. This is the material context and the material reality. In this context, what we've seen on campuses is not only the emergence of white supremacy in and around Trump, of the intersection of far-right, extreme, open fascism, anti-Semitism, Nazism in the case of some of the people that attacked us, as well as the underlying structures of white supremacy as an embedded institutional practice. Right? We're talking about anti-imperialism, about global imperialism, about the deep structures of US imperialism, of the military. We're talking about the police, we're talking about ICE. And at the same time, we're talking about Richard Spencer, Milo Yiannopoulos, the Daily Stormer, these quasi-fringe groups that under different historical circumstances would be at a certain distance from power, but as we know today, are directly aligned with it. Through Breitbart, through Steve Bannon, through the linkage that Milo, for example, provided of open white supremacists into Breitbart, thereby into the White House. So we have this moment in which there's this approximation between the deep structures of white supremacy, the long-term structures of white supremacy, and those very, very fringe, open Nazi elements. And I say this also because it has a strategic importance. There are some voices that say, well, if you're fighting the Nazis, you're not focusing on the real questions. And there are some people say, well, if you're focused on these long-term questions, you're negating, neglecting the existence of these real Nazis. And the reality is that both these forces are very much aligned. When Trump is endorsed by not only the Fraternal Order of Police, but the Border Patrol Union, and you see that these are organizations that represent the most fascistic embedded elements in the institutional apparatus of the United States, then you can see, and then when you see that after Trump is elected, one of the initial executive orders or statements says we stand with the forces of order, we stand with the police, we stand with the military, we don't stand with the looters and the rioters, meaning Ferguson, meaning Black Lives Matter. And when they then, of course, send troops to the border, as they're doing right now, when they institute orders like the so-called Muslim ban, in which before the order was even enforced in airports, Border Patrol officials were enforcing it themselves, autonomously because they wanted it. You can see that the sort of interplay between these far-right fringe elements and the deep institutional white supremacist, settler colonial structure of the United States is profound. And the interaction between the two is profound, and so our response has to be, I think, simultaneous in that sense as well. So you have these provocation campaigns on campus that have provoked a crisis around this question of free speech. Free speech, academic freedom, like social media, need to be understood on this material and historical terrain. We need to understand that free speech has never really been a thing. It's never really been it's never been free. It's never been universal. It's never been equally or symmetrically determined. It's been a question of whose speech matters. Even in these specific cases, we're talking about visitors coming to campus from outside of the academic community, paid for by sometimes by quasi-members of the community, sometimes not, sometimes by private money. And we have students mobilizing, members of the academic community, and saying, we don't want these people here. These people constitute an existential threat to us. We don't consider them members of the community. We don't think they're offering anything to this community. And doing so with their speech, doing so with their assembly. And the question is, which of those voices is privileged by the power structure? Which is seen as the legitimate voice? Hell, which side is defended by the ACLU? And it's only one side. It's the side of the person sitting up here on the platform, and it's not the students. It's not specifically not the students of color. It's not those who are mobilizing and using their speech and using their assembly in a way that is pretty clearly defended and protected in constitutional terms. It's the other side. And that's the way it's always been. This has never really been a question of free speech. It's always been a question of whose speech matters. So Eric Garner was free to use his speech, right? He was free to tell everyone that he was being choked to death by the New York Police Department on Staten Island, and it didn't matter. And it didn't matter that it was caught on tape, and it didn't matter what he said because he was being killed by the state. His speech was free in that sense. And this raises the question of whether or not free speech is even a framework that is useful for us. There's a sector that I would call the free speech absolutists that think we should support and accept all speech. And some of them claim to be on the left. I think that's an unsustainable position because what you're literally saying is that, for example, when Milo Yiannopoulos comes here and harasses and incites and brings violent threats down upon a member of your community, that the left should sit back and accept it. Rather than mobilizing, rather than attempting to stop it from happening, they should accept it. I think that's not a coherent leftist position. Academic freedom is, as a concept, is useful. It's more useful. I like to think of it as a shield. Shields are never enough, but shields are necessary. In part because it allows us to defend a certain kind of academic community from private money, or to attempt to defend the rights of the community to stand up and make decisions, to insist that all members of that community count, right? Particularly those who are specifically and systematically marginalized. And it allows us to take seriously the concerns of that community in a way that is very rarely done. One of the challenges, and I think when we were talking about this earlier, one of the challenges of whether it's dealing with the questions of Palestine or dealing with questions of Black Lives Matter is precisely that those are the voices that just don't count. Those are the least authorized political voices. And on campus, for example, when I found myself dealing with these questions on campus, in the campus community, I found that white dudes' voices mattered, right? Those are the ones that were taken seriously. They were the only ones that were taken seriously, to be honest. And all those members of the community that didn't come from that sector were not, and were not part of the equation, and their voice did not matter because they were precisely subjugated and relegated to a position in which speech was not free. Speech was not accessible to them, effective speech. Regardless of free speech, academic freedom situated on this terrain, we're also confronting, of course, white supremacy, global imperialism, and an increasingly open resort to fascism by certain groups. And this is where you really get to a point where you're just like, no, your speech doesn't matter, right? Regardless, it's a very American thing, right, to say, oh, this sort of free speech absolutism. And if you go to sort of talk to someone in Germany or Italy and tell them that Nazis should be able to stand up and speak, it sounds kind of absurd, right? Because you're talking about two people who understand the consequences of this, who experienced it, who lived it, and have come to terms with it, and who don't see it as any threat to liberal democracy, for example, even if you're a liberal Democrat, to recognize that there are limits to that speech, limits to the kind of organizing that should be acceptable, and just beyond all that, an imperative to fight these forces and to destroy them. And that's, I think, really the point. Because when we begin to view these things on their proper historical terrain, when we understand the nature of our moment, we understand this isn't an abstract question of speech or freedom or anything. It's a question of defeating reactionary forces that are gaining power, that are taking advantage of economic crisis and economic disaffection, that are scooping up those who've been left behind by decades of neoliberalism and giving them false explanations to pull them to the right, blaming migrants, blaming Muslims, creating and whipping up a nativism that is a false explanation, right? It doesn't explain what's been going on in the Rust Belts over the last 20 years. And the imperative of the left is to provide these alternative explanations, to provide an alternative for people who are really, truly suffering under neoliberalism, and to understand that simultaneously we need to be confronting and resisting white supremacist fascists. What this looks like on campus, I'm sure many people are familiar with. A lot of people call it deplatforming. The refusal of these platforms to white supremacists, to Nazis. It happens in the streets as well, but if we're talking about campuses, we're talking about the ways in which students should always be authorized to come together to organize and to shut things down, to prevent these kind of speakers from doing what they have been doing, which is recruiting. Not speaking, not spreading ideas, but recruiting. These are ideas and these are words that are inseparable from the violence that they embody. And that even if we're thinking in abstract terms of speech, white supremacy, racist speech always entails a censorship. It always entails a ban, because it's premised upon the fundamental inequalities between people. If you think certain groups of people are fundamentally less than human, or as Richard Spencer puts it, like, are they soulless golem, you don't believe in their speech. You don't believe that their words are valid either. And so one of the many deep contradictions of these groups coming to campus and demanding speech, aside from the fact that it's simply a cynical ploy to create a crisis, is that fundamentally they don't believe in it. And here again, we confront the limitations of a liberal universalism that says, oh no, we believe in speech for everyone, when our enemies actually don't believe that, right? We believe that everyone should be able to come to campus when our enemies know, because they do it to us, that we need to be excluded from those campuses. We need to be brutally threatened. We need to be driven out. That we're in the middle of a war, and they want to win. And if we don't also want to win, then it's going to be very difficult for us to come out of it alive. I haven't talked much about social media. My apologies. But in terms of just thinking about how it is that we confront these forces on campus, and I'll finish up as quickly as I can. It's a question of understanding, at the same time, these underlying fundamental structures of what the university is, of what white supremacy and imperialism and colonialism are in the nature of our very, the long-term nature of this country. And understanding what that means for universities, understanding the role that they've historically played as colonial and imperial forces, understanding their role in perpetuating these ideologies, and fighting against those in a transformational way. We need to not only be defending campus spaces from the right, but also transforming those spaces, revolutionizing, decolonizing those spaces. And that's, of course, one of the best ways to defend them as well. One of the best ways to shift away from this sort of abstract understanding of what it means to have an academic community and to really engage as a community of equality, a community that wants to expand access, that wants to expand access to the intellectual pursuit beyond the very narrow realm that exists now, and that wants to make sure that everyone's voice, not only voice, but participation in those communities is an effective one, right? Not just can you speak, but does that matter when you do speak? And it means confronting simultaneously these forces that are attempting to provoke a crisis on our campuses. Having better arguments that don't fall back on simply upholding speech for everyone, but thinking hard about what it would mean to defend campuses from white supremacy. And in short, overall, making campuses an unsafe space for white supremacy.
Before Anish gets started, one thing I'll say, you can hand him the mic, is, and we were talking earlier about the difficulties that both of these academics are having finding academic positions, and what an absolute crime I think that is. And when I watched and listened to them talk, it really made me sad, because these guys are teachers. I mean, and all of us who are in higher ed, we see it, These are people who, at their heart, are teachers and are professors. I mean, not even more than teachers. And so, the sort of what I take to be really just the blackballing that's obviously going on, formally or informally, to prevent them from finding positions, I think. It's wrong on every level, but listening to them both talk on a personal level, it's really also just curious.
Fascinating talks. So I have not a question, but a comment and observation that there may be something even more insidious that's going on, and this relates to actually one of the defenses I attended of one of the students in sociology. And what he's doing since the 1970s, he's looking at the congressional roll calls. And there is directionality towards conservative ideas, and his topic is military spending and why it keeps just going up, and the US spends equal to the next 8 countries combined, right? It's 10 times more than Russia. So, and he's the former vet, so he's looking at it more quantitatively. But I was struck how even the Democratic, so during the time when it's Democrats who control the Congress, the directionality stays the same way. It dips a little bit, but it continues, and the gap has been widening since the 1970s. So in some ways, we have lost the discursive battle in a big way. So even if you win, if Hillary Clinton wins, not a lot of change regarding education or military spending. We won't see monumental changes there. So how to kind of face that kind of challenge that has been going on for a long time?
There was this joke about Clinton, right? Hillary Clinton, that if she wanted to win, she shouldn't have helped to mass incarcerate her base. which is not it's not a joke. I mean, she helped play an active role in pushing through this 94 crime bill, which was in many ways crystallized, I think, this rightward shift and the utter abandonment of any kind of progressive politics. Of course, there were sparks of this in Jesse Jackson in the 80s. But what you've seen is this drift, and in which something which in many ways was started by Republicans, this radical criminalization of blackness, especially ramping up in the 70s and 80s, absolutely open, not open, a clear strategy by Republican strategists to destroy progressive causes, white and black, by demonizing black Americans, by racializing the state, racializing social welfare and unemployment benefits, to the point of racializing public education, so that even education, which of course benefited a prior generation of white, middle class families, is seen as unnecessary or less necessary or not a public good anymore. And very effectively, this strategy, encompassed both parties. It's very clear. I mean, there's no real argument, counter-argument, to the point that the Congressional Black Caucus entirely embraces this sort of criminalization ideology as well. And Keeanga-Yamah's book, actually, Black Lives Matter, Black Liberation, I think is a really great account of where this narrative comes from, how it's pushed, and how it develops and deepens. And this is where the explosive fury of Ferguson and Baltimore comes out of, because it's this sort of fracturing of a certain community and the empowerment of certain elites in a way that it goes hand in hand with this criminalization campaign. This is one, I think, aspect of what we've seen happen. As to how you fight against it is very difficult, right? And especially very difficult to do so within this party system. And I think part of the reason that you see constant pressure in the streets is because that's the only thing that works. I mean, even going back, when you're talking about civil rights, when you're talking about other, even discursive narrative transformations, transformations of consciousness, it's been only the result of pressure in the streets. It's those movements that are the only possible solution that we have to this, even if we're up against a really sort of difficult struggle.
I think I could probably talk without a microphone. Never mind. I'll talk with a microphone. So, thank you both for your talks. They were really, really fascinating. And it had me thinking a lot about, so last year, UWM received, by some work from some amazing kind of professors here, received the Next Gen grant from the NEH, right? To kind of rethink doctoral education and the ways in which doctoral education can kind of be put into play so that not everyone is going for academic jobs, since there aren't enough of them because of kind of some of the forces you all talked about. Excuse me. And a lot of the direction that our conversations took were toward the idea of public humanities. And I'm interested to hear what you think about, because this is actually something that's taking hold rather largely across a fair amount of institutions. And I actually find, so much good can come from the idea of a public humanities. And yet, given this specific moment that we are in, and the specific moment that we've been in for a while, that seems to actually introduce some really big problems, the idea of a public humanities, right? Because then you have post-colonial scholars who are trying to, do something more public with their work, and then receiving backlash, whether or not it's, kind of a purposeful kind of public statement or not. And so I'm wondering kind of how do you guys think we balance kind of those really difficult questions when we say we want to make kind of both our scholarly work, but also work beyond academia more public facing, and yet we have to deal with these kind of really problematic forces?
Thank you for the question. It's I'll confess, it's been a little while since I've thought at least closely about a notion of the public humanities, which, like you, I'm attracted to for various reasons. First of all, it strikes me as important to contextualize any notion of the humanities with critical thought and criticism. And I know that that's inherent to most people's understanding of what the humanities is, but centering it, or at least acknowledging it, allows us as well to broaden our idea of what the humanities can encompass and what it entails, that it doesn't necessarily need to be carried out on campuses, informal classrooms, in institutional spaces, that a practice or performance of the humanities can happen wherever people are thinking closely about the conditions that affect their lives. In terms of the backlash, it's not a good enough reason in my mind to curtail the pursuit. That part of the reason the backlash exists, in fact, is to stifle these efforts, to restrict humanities to certain geographical or institutional spaces, or to render it in such a way to where it's not especially threatening to power. So the backlash arises very often from people being sincerely upset, right, or people being sincerely offended, but its function is fundamentally disciplinary. Right? The backlash is the disciplinary mechanism, and so in no notion of the humanities that I can think of, a productive notion of the humanities, can it be contained by the demands of a disciplinary mechanism, right? Or it's not something that can be disciplined. In other words, we have to push forward. Individuals who are taking up this work, in turn, have to think about the potential outcomes of the kinds of criticism that they want to raise, or the kind of work that they want to do, activism, intellectual or otherwise. But as a project, right, public humanities, any sort of critical project, right, should move forward despite the potential for backlash. And it is up to the people who are organizing these communities to be aware of potential problems, potential backlash, potential negative outcomes, and to plan for those potential negative outcomes in the process of moving the project forward, and thinking of ways most important to be in solidarity with one another, with your comrades, your community members, in such a way that nobody will be left out to dry. But I think that you have to push forward anyway.
Yeah, one second. So I wanted to answer that one, because we're on the public humanities question. I mean, and I've sort of been involved with the next iteration of the Next Gen project. But I think that and I've been skeptical of public humanities, as I've been skeptical of digital humanities, and for the same reason, that and I think more so in digital humanities than in public humanities, but I think that there's a danger in the development of these kind of new brands of humanities of de-criticalizing them. And I think what's crucial, and it's not to say that all digital humanities is uncritical, and it's especially not to say that all public humanities is uncritical, because that's not true. But I do think we have to be vigilant and make sure that we keep our focus not only on the publicness of humanities, but on the criticality of humanities as well. So as many of you here know, one of the things we've done at C21 is reoriented our focus now to focus on critical public and digital humanities. But we've put critical first, because that has to be part of what we do. And I do think there's, I think with both of you, I'm both attracted to these new modes of practicing humanities, but feel like we need to be just alert and aware of the possibilities of, let's say, humanities being taken over by a less critical project. Yeah, right.
Yeah, I think this dovetails on that, and I want to push it a little bit farther with the question, what would militant scholarship look like? What does it look like? And how does it dovetail or deal with the intact modes of scholarship that kind of define our professionalism, our pedigree culture, our celebrity culture, our the very things that often are really the career-making kinds of benchmarks of an academic career.
That's a really good question. And one of the things I was going to say with regard to the sort of public humanities question is also that, but I don't want to in any way abolish the university as a space to really just do scholastic thought, if that's what you want to do, right? Or to just really nerd out and study things that maybe no one gives a shit about, but you do. Because I think that's great and important. But at the same time, I think a lot of us are drawn, and I think the university needs to be conceived in a certain way as being integrated into these broader questions and engaging with them. Now, of course, there's a very reactionary or neoliberal way that this is done. And I think one of the strategic things that public humanities can do is to sort of latch onto that a little bit and say, I mean, certain universities want to have this image of being very much speaking to the public and, and engaged in big questions. And that's something we can do strategically. But I think that's not, of course, militant scholarship necessarily. And I think militant scholarship is a huge question. But I think it's grounded in a kind of humble engagement with organizing communities in a way that doesn't think of the intellectual or the professor or the scholar as being in any way a bringer of truth to those communities, but someone who's providing certain, maybe certain concepts, certain ideas, in organizing spaces sometimes, in public intellectual work and writing sometimes, recognizing what's going on in the world, diagnosing it, putting it into language that helps to press movements forward and encourage them and legitimize them in the public sphere. And I'm saying this just sort of throwing out a list of things that I see people doing all the time when we see movements exploding, right? Whether it's in Ferguson or elsewhere. What is it that we can do productively to engage with those movements? How is it that we can push back the tendencies to denounce, discredit, undermine the authority of movements, irrationalize those movements, in an attempt to sort of instead build a basis, a broad intellectual basis for the forces that are going to change our country.
Yeah, that's, I want to second Gio, both in the answer and his observation that that's a really good question. In some ways it's a fraught question, and it's one that takes a lot of minds working on, and so it's a question I hope that all of us will carry with us as we leave the room this evening and continue to think about. It seems to me at least partly contingent on what we want to conceptualize as militant scholarship. I think different people in the room get different imagery in their minds when they think of what is militant. If we take it to mean a type of scholarship that is engaged somehow in activist communities or revolutionary communities that are seeking to foster or create material change, or changes in racial structure, or changes in economic inequity and so forth, then there are models, important models, that illustrate how to do it. And I'm thinking of my own field. I mean, I guess it's technically my former field, but I still I still identify with it to the extent that they'll have me in American Indian Studies or Native American Studies, which is indigenous studies more broadly, which is deeply trained on matters of decolonization. We might not necessarily use the word militant to describe the commitments, although depending on the title, it might be appropriate, but it is a type of scholarship that is deeply rooted in the communities with which it's concerned and that is deeply interested in structural change. It's interested in playing a role and participating in the building of nations, extant nations, but building them into something bigger and more permanent. It's deeply interested in what practices of decolonization might look like, how certain societies are going to be transformed through it, what kind of world is going to exist at the end of it. So I would, you know, whether you call it militant scholarship or decolonial scholarship or, you know, revolutionary scholarship, whatever you want to call it, I think it's important. It's a beautiful methodology and a really interesting and difficult methodology to try to think through what kind of world we want to one day inhabit and what the world might look like beyond the ways that we already imagine it. And that to me is a kind of militant or revolutionary or decolonial scholarship that it's trained on transformation. Thinking of books like Glenn Coulthard, Red Skin, White Masks, which of course is a play on Fanon. And in that book, Coulthard, he discusses, you know, sort of violence or militancy as a kind of strategy, as a decolonial strategy, but he also spends a lot of time thinking through what the world might look like, right, once indigenous nationhood is honored and exists on all four corners of the continent. And that's just one disciplinary example. So the saying is, if we keep looking at examples in feminist scholarship, in African American scholarship, Native scholarship, and so forth, these attempts are happening, and I think that they provide a really wonderful foundation, methodologically, philosophically, politically, for us to engage with and to build from.
I'm going to bring it more closer to the social media end. I know a series of questions have been more interested in kind of the politics of the university, but I was more interested in kind of the platform's responses to your harassment. And I know that you had said you had like 6 lawyers, Steve, who were kind of looking over this. Were there any interest in trying to even dive deeper into your privacy and maybe retrieve your DMs to try to use that against you? And if so, was there any response from the platform itself?
I actually didn't hear anything from the platform. It was a kind of strangely disembodied vessel in all of this that didn't seem to be involved, even though it's the site on which all the controversy had happened. No, the DMs and so forth, nobody, to my knowledge, has ever sort of accessed them or looked at them. But in the lawsuit that I eventually settled with the University of Illinois, we had not gone far enough along in the discovery process for those DMs to be accessed, and they would have been accessible. You know, so you know, some site of authority would have gotten access to them had the lawsuit proceeded at pace. But my sense is that, and I don't know, I really can't put myself in their shoes too strongly. I guess we had Zuckerberg, you know, testifying over the past few days. Maybe he can provide some insight, but I didn't listen to him. I'll admit. I just looked at the funny pictures and memes. Anyway, but I don't know if a platform like Twitter is agnostic on these controversies, or if it's agnostic on these controversies precisely because they understand that in a large sense the controversies drive the business model. That we're consumed in a way by the kind of drama that gets created on the platform, but there was no interaction with the managers of these social media from my end. I don't know if Gio had a different experience. Does that answer your? What's that?
I was wondering in particular about the death
Gotcha.
threats.
Sorry,
And
yeah.
yeah, sorry, I left that for that one.
No, you didn't. I forgot. I just started
Yeah,
rambling.
yeah,
I
that was
tangent
part of it.
Elsewhere.
Yeah, that's a good start.
I
policy,
do
I'd
not-
imagine.
I do not recall getting death threats on Twitter. When I pissed off the right wing at Virginia Tech, I think I had a Twitter account, but I never used it at that point. In fact, I think that's when I began using it. All the death threats I got that I've ever received in my life have happened on email and voicemail. So I'm guessing Gio and Kyanga and others got them, so they might be able to answer better.
No, I don't have much to say, and I'm sure you know most of it, which is worse than sort of that Twitter is this special kind of hell that is tendentially Nazi. That is just it's like a haven of Nazis, and especially until about a year ago, Nazis would get banned. Right? It would be actually people on the left who would get banned for being too provocative toward those in power or toward other influential accounts. And maybe that's changed a little bit, but I mean, of the sort of like hundreds, I mean, easily hundreds of death threats, not all in DMs because you don't leave your DMs open that long. You just shut that down. They don't usually result in someone being banned. They get suspended, they get told to delete a tweet, and they get to go on harassing people, which they do semi-professionally. One other thing to say, which is, it's not exactly relevant, which is that it came out, in my case, that Russian bots were involved. I think my line is and always has been that I don't care where these bots are located and don't want to participate in any sort of absurd red scare. But they're non-human actors, right, amplifying these things. And this was obvious to people when it was happening because of the speed, the virality with which these things were spreading, that there were some non-human actors sort of interfacing and speeding these things up and sort of catapulting them.
Well, at least before the at least before the last question, Twitter and social media appeared to be pretty much of a red herring in this discussion, and I want to ask about that because the articulation of the material and social context and the historical realities of structures of oppression that have been mentioned tonight, whether it's white supremacy, settler colonialism, structural racism, these existed long before social media. I mean, there were professors being driven out of the academy a long time ago, to the point that there were suicides. And so is the question of social media a distraction, actually? Have we mistaken its agency in many of these debates to be more causative than it really is? Does social media provide us with a disruption, or is it simply another rearticulation of the same old thing?
Which is that, as Steve pointed out, one of the tendencies, the primary tendency of those that want to discipline you in these cases is to individualize this and say, this is because of something you did, right? Because it's very easy to point to something and say, that started this, right? And therefore to not think of the context or the other contributing factors or the other necessary conditions. In other words, in my case, this tweet led to this outcome, right? But that outcome would not have happened were it not for an organized campaign of white supremacist media outlets connecting to each other, feeding into each other, and doing something consciously on purpose. And so this individualization thing is one very clear piece that happens in all these cases. How is it that we can point toward an action by this individual and say that that's the cause? But that, in many ways, overlaps directly with this idea that, it's the media, it's the form, right? It's the mechanism that in some ways, and this is the sort of It needs to be kind of condescending, well, you should know better than being on Twitter, right? I've had a media studies scholar say that to me. And I was like, sure, you know this better. You know better than to think that that's actually true. Because as I said, it's any kind of media at this point. And again, these are all very much teachable, very much quickly reproducible, subject to virality, but it could be anything. Some people say 140 characters, and that was too much. And when I was finally suspended, it was over an entire thread, which was a full paragraph, a full, well thought out paragraph, constructed, academically sound, and it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter. Partly because it can be chopped up anyway, partly because it doesn't matter at all, right? The point is not to make sense. The point is to really, drive these things forward. And I'm guessing the same as in prior generations, where the point was not to make a coherent argument, but it was to use whatever media terrain existed as a way of carrying forth a very clear project. It just so happens, I think, that because of the kind of media terrain that we operate on, viral harassment is a key tool of the right. This is one key element of the so-called alt-right, and I think it's important to understand what separates the alt-right from just other sort of fascist and other organizations, because this question of online harassment is key. It's been fine-tuned. Milo developed it in Gamergate, which was a misogynistic harassment campaign online, and it became one of the key tools they use, and they still use effectively, very effectively. To the point where when it happens to universities still don't know what's happening. All they know is that they're getting 1,000 emails. And they assume that each of those emails originates with an organic human being with a separate consciousness that wants to express their heartfelt concern, right? And what they're not realizing is these are online forums, these are Reddit discussion groups, these are other mechanisms that are being used to sort of mass bombard in a very, very effective way, naive institutional structure.
I have no qualms in confessing that Gio knows a lot more about these processes than I do. So I've been thinking a lot about whether social media create new iterations of power or whether they simply facilitate extant power. And I feel like they just facilitate extant power. I don't know though. We'll see what happens as time goes on. One notable thing that social media has done to me, and I don't know quite how to work this out intellectually, is I'm interested in how it's been a means of creating celebrity, individual celebrity. I don't just mean through controversy. I'm fascinated by the question of how people come from nowhere. You've never heard of them, and all of a sudden they have like 120,000 followers, and they're getting interviewed on CNN. And so these are the types of power, I guess, that I see attending to social media. But no, I don't think that, at this point anyway, it would be accurate to say that social media is doing anything other than providing a different platform for the same old exercise of negative power.
So, and the last question, but before that, as the person who created the social media and academic freedom rubric, and as somebody who does do media theory, I'll be slightly impolite and slightly disagree. We'll both agree and disagree with our speakers and with the premise of Greg's question. That is, I think that what we need to understand, so I would never say, yes, it's as a result of any form of mediation, but I don't think we want to say it's simply a result of power and that the mediation is a kind of dependent and neutral, let's say, means. I think that power and media always co-create. I think that certainly back through Benjamin and Krakow and the Frankfurt School that we see this articulation. And so, no, the media don't simply create. They certainly don't create first off, and I think they don't simply create, but I think that the terrain is very different. So when Gio talks about the viralities, the bots, the intensity, it's not just that he tweeted or Steve tweeted, it's that there is this whole organized mechanism that is a co-creation of power between media forms of technologies of mediation and power. So it would never eliminate the question of power, but I think we can't eliminate the question of mediation either. So that would be sort of my way of just enhancing really what you guys are saying. I study the media part of it, so I emphasize that more, but I would never want to strip out these questions of power. So that would be sort of my sort of take on it. Yeah.
So I actually, I've been wondering throughout this conversation, precisely because both of you have in fact really suffered in more ways than you are polite enough to mention. There seems to me to be a repositioning of the intellectual and the community. And the community here would be both that of, right-wing crowds, which are, sort of conglomerating into these powerful bludgeons on the media, as well as dissent that comes from people like us, who, don't quite form that kind of bludgeon, but we do exist. So I think this repositioning also needs to be put into this historical framework. I mean, there was a time where the public intellectual was a very serious figure in the US. I'm thinking of Said and others, right? And that figure now seems to have dispersed. And it's dispersed actually quite a lot into digital media, whether online or in various ways, and in the form of, let's say, newsletters, where several people are putting out precisely the kind of news that you're talking about, Gio, precisely the kind of analysis you're talking about, and precisely a kind of, temporary community, if you wish, which covers the individual from exceptional risk. So somewhere what I'm thinking about here is that, maybe I'd like to hear you talk about, what has happened to the public intellectual? What is the nature of the risk that was attached to that kind of position, which is now dispersed in different ways, onto whatever is seen as undesirable by the right, and how, people who are opposing the right are also coming together on the same media. And whether you think that this would be a way of actually rethinking what we mean even by something like militant scholarship. What is the collective nature of that scholarship? Because this is, this kind of crowd formation, these were lynch mobs once upon a time, and they still are in many parts of the world. They are still lynch mobs who now appear, online. So how do we think about, resistance, about continuing to perform and to enact certain kinds of analysis, which are not tied to exceptional risk, but which do not dissolve individual voices either? I see you both as having suffered exceptional risk.
Question. Partly because actually I'm not sure that I see much dispersal of risk happening yet. Although I think that the idea that we should be seeking out forums that might do so are key. And I think one of the rules of thumb when it comes to coming out of organizing, especially coming out of community, organizing communities, that when you're talking about things like FBI infiltration, repression, when you're talking about how it is that you can, prevent and protect against these kinds of mechanisms, the answer is always the mass question. In other words, you're only protected insofar as you are part of or connected to a mass. And mass movements are the best protection I think that we have. A way to respond quickly and directly to these situations. But these are just kind of parameters. It's not to say that there's an easy way to go about doing that and engaging in that way. But when you're talking about the transformation of public intellectualism, I think it's really interesting because when you see these things in historical stages, you see a period of the discrediting of a certain kind of intellectual, and you see the re-emergence of popular movements not that long ago. I mean, if we're talking in the short term about the past 7 or 8 years, throwing forth their own kind of public intellectuals in a completely new context. in a very mediatic context, and coming up against dangers and challenges, not only of repression, but also co-optation. If you look at people like Derek Gasson, if you look at the intellectuals that come out of struggles on the street and that are swept up into, corporate and, nonprofit funding apparatuses. And these are all threats, I think, to this question of what it is that we try to do when we get out there and engage in this kind of work. I think we're very far from building, a structure that will help us to defend ourselves. I think people are being thrown into situations where they have to figure out on the fly what kind of intellectual they can be and what kind of alternatives they can build, whether it's outside of the university or inside of it. And I don't think we're very far along on that.
It's a wonderful set of questions you raised for us. I don't have anything interesting or useful to add, unfortunately, and I apologize for that. And except, a kind of a crudely skeptical response about the idea in this day and age of the public intellectual. It was always a phrase or a term under some contest. It never had a particular definition, and its definition, of course, changed according to geography and nation and language and so forth. But in the social media age, I see it more than anything as a branding mechanism, and I feel like it's under the rubric or the category of public intellectual that so many people brand themselves into existence, peddling foreign policy interests and the economic interests of the elite under a loose patent of liberalism. That and I think also about the way that our employers now, not my employers anymore, but your employers now in academia have seized upon the moment of social media branding and the idea of a public intellectual, and far from being discouraged from using social media. In fact, most academics are encouraged to use it by their bosses, by the managerial class, just not in the way that Chico and I do, right? We're supposed to use it politely, or in a way that corresponds to the university's overall branding, right? And so we're supposed to become public intellectuals, but I don't know what the distinction between public intellectual and marketer is anymore. I think they've increasingly sort of moved closer together, and I know that doesn't really get at the spirit of your question and comments, but there are things that I want to keep thinking about, and I'm really grateful for you for having said what you did, because it's going to keep me thinking for at least a few days, if not longer.
So one last. And then please join us upstairs. We can eat and drink.
Thank you. Thank you for your input. I'm not an academic, but I follow you, Stephen, and I appreciated your succinct tidbits on Facebook. And I always learn new words. So I'm thinking about the history of, for example, the first Gulf War, where the Bush administration was angry at CNN having sent that British journalist, I forgot his name, and then in Serbia bombing the Clinton administration, bombed the TV station, and then Al Jazeera, the old Al Jazeera, the better Al Jazeera, not the one that is now, sent a reporter, forgot his name, out to Fallujah, otherwise we won't know what happened in Fallujah. And then fast forward to one of the countries, so-called Arab Spring, where the Obama administration asked Twitter not to perform a software update on a weekend where there are going to be demonstrations, to allow those folks running these demonstrations in that country to tweet and so on. Having said all that, I'm wondering, And then you spoke about, both of you spoke about the restrictions that are happening on campus where you called it manipulating the student body and, using adjunct. I'm wondering if if social media is not becoming a monopoly for spreading information, and then whether powers can't be switched on and off whenever insurrection is going to happen or not, or whenever information needs to be spread, because we're putting all our eggs in this basket, and I call Facebook right now, I can't live without it and I can't live with it, for example. And I wonder if the powers that be are not gonna, and the theories, whether it's true or theory, that Facebook won over MySpace, and it's obviously MySpace almost disappeared because CIA funding or something. I don't know if it's true or not, but there are theories out there why Facebook is as big as it is now. So aren't we putting all our information gathering and studies and sharing, and then poof, it can be turned off in a second?
Yeah, I agree. That especially in the sense that when people talk of social media as potentially revolutionary platforms, I pause, because these are private companies owned by billionaires, and I don't understand how any kind of revolutionary politics can be carried out under the aegis of a billionaire who owns a private company, right? These are not spaces for a revolution to occur. But this isn't to say that social media, that is, don't perform important functions in our personal lives and in our communal lives as writers, as people interested in politics and so forth. But you talk about the reliance. I have the reliance on, especially on Facebook. I think Twitter is more voluntary than Facebook for most people. And I feel like my entire sense of social existence is tied to some degree into that platform, right? Years ago, you would go listen to a talk, and somebody in the audience, let's say it was a talk on Palestine or Iraq or South Africa or whatever, somebody would always ask, what news sources do you look at? Nobody asks that anymore, because we all go to Twitter and Facebook or whatever to get our news. There are no websites in my rotation. I go to Facebook, I read the feed, people share articles, I click them, and that's where I do my reading, or my Twitter feed sometimes, all right? And I don't know enough about the technical aspects of what's been happening in this challenge that the government is trying to mount against Facebook, but I suspect that a lot of it has to do with the unease of traditional corporate media vis-a-vis the amount of power Facebook has accrued. And so if Facebook has accrued a certain amount of power based on our reliance on the platform and our uses of the platform in ways that make us feel more connected and more viable as activists, then we also have to remember that it's that very power that can be taken away from us immediately. So there always has to be not a grain of salt, but a sense of perspective in how organizing gets done on these platforms, because in the end, they're not only privately owned, but our information becomes their private property. And if we're going to think about social or structural transformation, of revolution, to go back to the language of the Arab Spring, then it's not going to be carried out through the mediation of these platforms. Those platforms might have some tangential role to play, but in the end, those platforms, if they're capable enough of sparking revolution, they're capable enough of shutting down revolution. And I think that's something that we have to keep in mind.
Yeah, no, I mean, basically the same thing. I mean, just to maybe put a slightly different spin on it, to say, we ran into trouble through Twitter because it matters. right? No one would give a shit if it didn't matter. No one would give a shit if it weren't so effective in doing a certain kind of thing, in moving information a certain kind of way. And I think that's important to remember because you could also say, you know, so that's sort of the means matter, and that's part of what happened to us. Also the content matters, right? Because we're talking about electrified third rails of politics, digital pastime, white supremacy, the things that if you touch them matter, right? And the fact that there's a reaction points to the fact that they matter, points to the fact that maybe this is useful, right? And it has to be useful. If we don't use these things, our enemies will. And so unless we have a sort of some kind of advanced Luddite strategy that allows us to break these technologies, I think we're going to be condemned to be using them.
And it's not, I should point out, just to add to it, I know you know this already, that it's not a uniform application of user standards anyway. You know, certain issues get a much shorter leash on these social media platforms, and those decisions aren't made in a vacuum. Facebook is notorious for removing posts and shutting down accounts that are, you know, are pro-Palestine or that criticize Israel. Notorious for it. Facebook tends to be much more tolerant of alt-right nonsense. So again, we have to think about these the mediation of news on social media as being affected by extant dynamics of power as well.
Great. Why don't you all join us? No, I'm not going to let you guys go. Join us in thanking Steve and Gio and